Hi, everyone. This is the first lecture of week 9. And as I stated before, by this point in the semester, we're going to cover a lot of text in a short amount of time. So your quizzes will include questions not only from the lecture, but also from your reading assignments of the biblical text, just because I do not have time to go over all these stories in the limited amount of space that I have on these videos, okay? This week and the next to some degree, we are going to turn to some of my favorite books in the Hebrew Bible. And if you find as you listen to this lecture that you're very, very interested, I, of course, teach exegesis classes on these particular books. Okay. And one of these books that I'm very interested in and that I teach kind of narrower classes on, and the one which I will start with here is the book of Judges. Okay. The book of Judges, which is found right after the book of Joshua, talks about the chaotic, anarchic state of Israel before the formation of the Israelite monarchy. And the book is called Judges because this was a period when Israel was ruled by a group called the Judges, who were kind of periodic rulers who were called by God to lead Israel for the duration of their lifetime. Okay. And judges did not pass on their leadership to the children, and that will be mainly what will change once you get the monarchy, right? Monarchy is, by definition, those who pass on their rule to their children. Okay, judges are also different from kings or the monarchy because they did in some ways, a much wider variety of functions. Okay, though called judges, they did more than just kind of adjudicate or decide cases. Okay, a good way to think about them is that they were kind of community or military leaders who had a lot of different jobs. You know, just kind of a jack of all trades. They were kind of like your priest, prophet, king, military, general, all rolled into one. And what will happen once the monarchy begins is that all these various roles encapsulated by the judge will kind of split off and become kind of separate roles. Okay. The book of Judges has received a lot of attention from feminist scholars in particular because of the varied, complex, and extremely interesting ways that women are described in the text. Okay. Judges is also, incidentally, the book with the stories that are almost the most graphic and the most sexual and the most centered on the body. Okay, so why does, the stories in Judges have this particular focus? Well, I mean, I'm going to give you a quick answer. Of course, there's a much more complicated, fuller answer. One interpretation is that Judges describes the period of time before the formation of the monarchy and stable government. That is, Judges kind of concerns that liminal period when Israel is being formed. Okay, or when Israel is becoming Israel, okay? And as a result, when Israel is wrestling with this question of who are we? Okay, who is an Israelite? Who is not an Israelite? What are we going to be? Okay, and these identity questions, that kind of center on national identity, right? And the nature of this kind of national body, as is often the case, get reflected in stories about human bodies and bodily activity, okay? Especially those of women whose bodies frequently embody and symbolize that of the nation state. Okay. So that's kind of Judges in a nutshell. It's, of course, a very complicated book. Judges opens with an account of how the Israelites came to settle in Israel that wildly differs from the one that you saw in Joshua. Joshua, as we discussed, envisions the settlement process as generally relatively straightforward. Israel spied out the land, they kind of scoped it out, then they battled people, destroyed and conquered everybody, and they took over. And at the end of the book of Judges, it seems like, the Israelites have been successful in emptying out the land. All they need to do is just divvy up the parcels of property, okay, to the various tribes. Contra Joshua, Judges 1 and 2 offer a wildly different counter narrative. Okay, in Judges 1 and 2, we learn that after Joshua's death, and possibly even before it, okay, that the Israelites were actually not really completely successful in driving the Canaanites out of the land. Okay. Indeed, the writer of Judges even proposes that the Lord deliberately left the Canaanites in place. Why? To live among the Israelites so that the Israelites can be tested. Okay. So the Canaanites become kind of these divine tests, okay? And test them, the Canaanites indeed do, as we see in Judges, okay? The Canaanites' continued presence in the land sets up a cycle that will be repeated throughout Judges as a whole. And the cycle goes something like this. You'll see this pattern over and over again in this book. The people of Israel sin. Okay, so God allows sometimes the Canaanites, but usually neighboring nations or enemies to oppress them. The people of Israel then repent and cry out to the Lord, who raises for them a judge. This judge restores peace by fighting Israel's enemies, and everything is well until that judge dies, at which point the people sin again and the cycle starts all over. Okay, and that really, you'll see that over and over again in Judges. Okay, and this cycle is evident in the story of the first judge we're going to look at, Ehud, whose story is found in Judges 3, verse 12 and following. Okay, sort of following that cycle or that cyclical pattern, we are told that the Israelites acted badly, so God allows them to be oppressed by Moab, a neighboring nation, which at that point we are told is led by King Eglon. Okay, and Eglon's name means calf. Okay. And you want to keep the meaning of his name in mind as you listen to what happens to him. Okay, when the Israelites cry out because of this oppression, God raises for them a judge named Ehud, who is described in your NRSV translation as, quote, Ehud, son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. Okay. However, as is often the case in the English translation, the translation really flattens a lot of the kind of clever wordplay in the Hebrew. Okay, Ehud's name means joining together or something like unity, which is of course, fitting, right? Because that's what he's going to do at the end. More importantly, he is described as a Benjaminite, and remember that Benjamin, the name Benjamin, has a particular meaning as well, right? What does Benjamin mean? Well, it means Ben, right? Son, and Yamin or Yamini, of my right side or my right hand. Okay, so notice this is a Benjaminite, son of my right hand, who is left-handed, right? So notice the kind of interesting characterization, right? But this word that's translated left-handed is also a bit more complicated, okay? In the Hebrew, it is iter yad yamino, or literally bound, or somehow constrained on the right side. So what you have really is this description of Ehud, son of Gera, the son of the right side, one who is bound on the right side. Okay, so notice how the kind of, in the Hebrew, the meanings kind of collapse onto each other. Okay, so Ehud seems to be a son of the right who is bound on the right, or somewhat left-leaning, right? So, okay, so what does that mean? Okay, most scholars think that this is a kind of fancy way of saying that that is Ehud, was ambidextrous. And we do, of course, know of some groups, Amazonians, for example, who deliberately bound up their right side or did something to one of their sides, right? The Amazonian women were supposed to cut off a kind of one breast, okay? So that they can learn to fight with both sides of their body. Right? And think about what an advantage this would be in wartime, right? If you are usually facing right-handed, right, warriors, if you can fight with both sides, this is extremely useful, okay? Indeed, this might be the reason why when you look at modern sports, which mimics warfare, there are a ton of left-handed athletes. And if you're curious, you can search this up on Google, okay? And this particular left-handed or ambidextrous ability seems to have been a skill particularly associated with Benjaminites, okay, who are said, ironically considering what their name is, right, who are said to not only be skilled left-handed warriors, but especially skilled in using slingshots. And you want to keep that in mind when we come to the stories about David and Saul, okay? What is interesting in Ehud's case is that right and left, right? So not only is right and left signifying something about his kind of warrior status or his ability to fight, but of course right and left also have a lot of symbolic meanings, okay? Probably in ancient Israelite culture, but also still, I mean, even in the modern context, it still has a lot of kind of symbolic connotations. Okay, so what is the right side associated with? Okay, well, the right side, I mean, look at the language, right? Think about with all of these things that are right? Or the right side is associated with honor and sovereignty, strength, aggressiveness, virility, goodness, blessing, morality, legitimacy. It signifies allegiance. This is why we take an oath with our right hand, fraternal love, handshakes with our right hand, benediction, inheritance. And of course, if, notice the binarism. So that's what the right is associated with. The left is now going to be associated with what? The very opposite. Okay, profanity, inactivity, feebleness, passivity, incapability, the nocturnal, the satanic, the dark side, black magic, sorcery, witchery, it's all the things that right is not symbolic of, okay? Unsurprisingly, in light of these different binaristic, dual values, the left is associated with the feminine, of course, and the right with the masculine. Okay, and if you start thinking about modern languages, especially Romance languages, you see the same symbolism, right? The French word gauche, right? Or let's say, our word right, okay? So it's still that those connotations associated with size remain, okay? Now, if you're interested, I have an article on this, okay? In the case of Judges 3, by making Ehud a son of the right side, bound on the right, okay, that is leftish, right? He is portrayed as a kind of ostensibly, maybe feminine, passive, maybe ostensibly weak, but really secretively powerful, aggressive, deadly, all the stuff associated with the right. Okay. In other words, he's kind of liminal. He's not one thing or another, right? He's even maybe a trickster, right? He gives you the appearance of one, but deep down underneath he's something else, right? He is also certainly an underdog, right? That is someone who is not part of the dominant group and therefore has to use indirect power such as cunning and secrecy and deviousness, right, to succeed, which is exactly what he does, right? And interestingly, Judges is really a book filled with underdogs. There's something wrong with each judge, something a little off, okay? And so this description, this kind of rich description of the Ehud, which you can't really get from just reading the English, it really sets up for what he does next, okay? And I'll read the English of what happens in Judges 3, but I'm also going to try to translate kind of or fill in along the way, okay? So this is Judges 3, verse 16 and following. Now Ehud made for himself a sword with two edges. Literally, it says a sword with two mouths. Okay, a cubit in length, that is about arm's length, and he fastened it on his right thigh. Remember, thigh can be a kind of euphemism for the genitalia. Okay, so he fastened it. I'm having a problem with this word on his right thigh underneath his clothes. Then he presented the tribute to King Eglon, or King Calf of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat, other translations are possible. Now Eglon was a very fat or very thick, like, you can look up videos of thick cats, okay, thick, okay, or buff man. Okay, so there's a variety of translations here. When Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent the people who carried the tribute on their way. But he himself turned back at the sculpted stones near Gilgal and said, I have a secret or hidden message or thing or object for you, O king. So the king says, silence. Well, it's translated as silence, okay. So the king said, be still. Another possibility. So the king said, don't say anything, idiots. And all his attendants went out of his presence, okay. There's a much richer variety of translations available if you know the Hebrew, okay. Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in the cool room chamber, or the private chambers, or the toilet. Again, we don't know quite what this word means, and said, I have a secret message or thing or object from God for you. So he arose from his seat, and then Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into Eglon's womb, or belly. The hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the sword out of his belly, and dirt or shit came out. Then Ehud went out into the vestibule and closed the doors of the roof chamber on him and locked them. After he had gone, the servants came, and when they saw that the doors of the roof chamber or the private room or toilet was locked, they thought, he must be taking a piss in the cool chamber. So they waited until they were embarrassed, and when he did not open the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key and opened them, and there was their Lord lying dead on the floor. Okay. Hopefully you'll be able to get a sense of the, what it says in the NRSV, even with my kind of, explanations. Okay, so this is a very rich tale. Okay, and again, I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to just kind of boil it down into two main readings. Okay, the first is that the story is very sexual or homoerotic. Okay, and according to this reading, Ehud, who is a kind of gendered, ambiguous warrior with a phallic weapon, the size of which is emphasized, and which is said to have two mouths, right? And notice the kind of fluctuation of gender here. Okay, and of course, this mouth, what do you call it? The sword with two mouths that he hides on his thigh, right? Goes to see Eglon, who, according to this reading, is buff or thick. Okay, tells him that he has a secret thing, a secret present for Eglon, who at this point sends everyone out of his chambers, which would be a weird thing to do, right? I mean, think about how everybody's getting the message here, and it's pretty risky, right? Because who is Ehud but, a servant of a kind of conquered nation, so you must be expecting something to send everyone away and be left unprotected, okay? So Eglon is probably imagining a very particular kind of present, okay? And indeed, Eglon receives this divine present, okay? That is this phallic-like described sword of Ehud, which goes into his womb or belly, it's the same word, and is swallowed up by it so much that its handle cannot even be, it is no longer visible, okay? So notice, according to this reading, this is imagined as a kind of rape, okay? Or feminization of the enemy. Okay, and notice the kind of homoerotic sexual nuances and the plays of gender evident here. Okay, another reading is that this is a humorous, humorous, comedic kind of tale. Okay, and in particular, there's a particular kind of humor here, what they call, the fancy word is scatological humor. Okay, that is like poop jokes, fart jokes, jokes based on the body. Okay. Again, the biblical writers are not PC, okay, and I do want to remind everyone, this is not my humor, okay, I'm not saying this, right, this is the biblical humor, okay, I don't know if that's better, but okay. According to this kind of comedic reading, I guess, Ehud, is imagined as this kind of stealthy assassin who goes in with a two-mouthed sword, right? Emphasizing, why is the mouth used here, or the description of the mouth of the sword used here? Well, it's to emphasize how much it and Eglon, who is described as fat, how much he likes to eat. Okay, so Ehud is a stealthy kind of guy who goes in to this fat king Eglon, okay, to deliver more tribute and presents, right? Who to this king who is imagined almost as a fatted calf. Okay, and not only a fatted calf, but he is also uncouth, right? How uncouth is he? Well, he's receiving presents while sitting on the toilet, which is not very nice, At this point, Ehud tells Eglon that he has a secret message or thing from God, and indeed delivers the secret message or thing by stabbing Eglon in the stomach, at which point, right, Eglon's fat closes over the blade and he shits himself, okay? All the while, of course, we are told that the servants are arguing over whether they can interrupt, Eglon, because, he's still on the toilet, maybe he's taking a piss. So there's a little bit of like funny nature there too. Okay. In this reading, this is, the use of scatological body humor, right, which is used to make fun of and denigrate Israel's enemies, the Moabites. Okay. Now, of course, this is not the only reading, right? A lot of people say, well, there's both layers are, exist here, right? They're, using a humor while also using kind of, notions of gender, to make fun of their enemy. Okay. So this is the first reading of the first book, and this is really how Judges begins, okay, which gives you a little bit of sense how the rest of Judges is going to follow. Okay, and for the next story on Judges, please turn to the next video.